During the first half of the 20th century, two distinct strands of orchestral trumpet style emerged in Britain. The style exhibited by Ernest Hall, principal trumpet of the London Symphony Orchestra from 1924 and of the BBC Symphony Orchestra from its formation in 1930, was characterised by purity of tone and minimal vibrato, while the other strand is regarded as deriving from the British brass band tradition. Through much of the 20th century, some of the most prominent trumpet players progressed directly from amateur brass bands to principal positions in major British orchestras without having been trained at a conservatoire or having served in a military band. In this paper, I will examine the early lives and careers of two of the most influential brass players of the first half of the 20th century, Herbert Barr and George Eskdale, both of whom began their musical journeys in brass bands. Their routes into the orchestral profession were very different, but interestingly, both gained wide recognition early in their London careers for their rendition of the high trumpet parts of Bach, in particular the Brandenburg Concerto No. 2. I will give an overview of their early careers from their arrival in London to securing permanent orchestral positions before considering their formative years and their route into the orchestral profession. Herbert Barr was appointed co-principal trumpet of the newly formed BBC Symphony Orchestra in 1930 at the age of 48 and played with the orchestra for 20 years. He is remembered primarily as being the first player in Britain to perform Bach's Brandenburg Concerto at its original pitch and not with the high passages transposed down an octave, as was customary at this time. Beyond this, his career has attracted scant attention. Barr is first encountered in London in early 1913 when he played in Thomas Beecham's orchestra for a season of Russian ballet at Covent Garden, which included the first London performance of Petrushka by Stravinsky. Reviews of the performances mention the high standard of orchestral playing, and the Daily Mail reported that the composer was of the opinion that his score had never been better played. It seems likely that Herbert Barr played the prominent cornet solo in these performances, given that in May of that year he was the sole trumpet player for a run of 8 performances of Richard Strauss's Ariadne of Naxos with the Beecham Symphony Orchestra. The review of the production in the Times described much of the orchestral playing as, quote, rough and ready, and some of it rough and unready. However, it singled out two of the solo instrumentalists for praise, the pianist and the trumpeter Mr. Barr. In July 1920, Bach played cornet in the world premiere of the Grand Suite from Stravinsky's Soldier's Tale. In a letter to Stravinsky following the performance, the conductor Ernest Ansermet singled out Herbert Barr for praise, comparing the dexterity of his cornet playing to that of a clarinetist. In June 1923, Barr played in the first public performance of William Walton's Facade, and it seems likely that he also performed in the private performance of the work the previous year. As already mentioned, it was as an exponent of the Baroque repertoire, and in particular the trumpet parts of Bach, that Barr built his reputation during the 1920s. At the 1920 Leeds Music Festival, he appeared as soloist in the performance for which he is remembered, the second Brandenburg Concerto at its original pitch. The critic for the Times noted that, quote, the exquisite delicacy of the ensemble was made perfect by the fact that Mr. Barr was using for the first time a small trumpet capable of playing the part as Bach wrote it. He also noted that while the Bach trumpet that Barr was using was frequently used in other works by Bach, this concerto was, quote, generally adapted to the ordinary instrument. He continued, there were none of the ear-splitting effects which sometimes mar Bach's trumpet parts, and none of the clumsy gambling which generally appears when the larger instrument is used. Barr is listed as performing Brandenburg II numerous times during the 1920s. In March 1926, he performed it with the London Chamber Orchestra under the direction of Anthony Bernard. The same ensemble, under Bernard, recorded the concerto in 1929, with many of the high passages in the trumpet part transposed down an octave. Robert Phillip has established that the unnamed trumpeter on this recording is Ernest Hall. In light of Barr's impressive rendition of the B minor Mass, which we will hear in a moment, it is unfortunate that he was not called upon for this session. However, a review of the 1926 Brandenburg performance in the Times reveals that on that occasion Barr had difficulties with the part. It seems likely that Bernard was playing safe by engaging Ernest Hall. We do not have a recording of Barr playing Brandenburg II, but a performance of Bach's B minor Mass with the Royal Choral Society and the Royal Albert Hall Orchestra, in which he is listed in the programme as playing first trumpet, was recorded, and some of the choruses were issued by the HMV Record Company. Here is the end of the Hosanna in Excelsis, in which we hear Barr's agility in the upper register and his sense of melodic line, and the tuba is barely audible. George Eskdale's career is well documented in the brass literature and needs only a brief summary here. He was principal trumpet of the London Symphony Orchestra from 1934 until 1954, and from the late 1930s taught at the Royal Academy of Music and Trinity College of Music. He recorded both the Brandenburg Concerto and the Haydn Concerto twice during his career. We will listen to short extracts from his earlier recording of both works. The Brandenburg Concerto recording is from 1935 and the Haydn from 1938. Herbert Barr was born in Bradford, Yorkshire in 1882. Further details of his family are thanks to the testimony of the late Bram Wiggins, with whom I had a phone conversation more than a decade ago. Wiggins was a pupil of Eskdale who joined his teacher in the LSO trumpet section in 1947 and worked with Barr regularly during the 1940s and 50s. He informed me that Herbert Barr's father played euphonium in a brass band and his two brothers, George and Alf, played cornet and trombone respectively. All three brothers eventually moved to London. George became solo cornet and band sergeant with the Scots Guards, and Alf freelanced as a trombonist with various London orchestras. Unfortunately, he had no knowledge of Bertie's activities between him playing in a brass band in Bradford and appearing as a professional player in London at the age of 31. This period in his career remained a mystery until I encountered a biographical article on Barr that appeared in the Musical Times and Herald in 1925. That this was part of a series of articles on prominent orchestral players points to the esteem in which he was held at that time. The article reveals that Barr worked in a wool warehouse in Bradford until 1907, when he moved to the seaside resort of Eastbourne on the south coast of England to join the private orchestra of the Duke of Devonshire. A permanent orchestra of up to 50 players was maintained intermittently by members of the Cavendish family, who held the title Devonshire since the 1870s. It is likely that Barr was a founder member of the iteration of the orchestra that was formed in 1907. Although it was described as a private orchestra, its performances were almost exclusively in the public sphere, most often in the Winter Garden on the edge of the town's Devonshire Park. The orchestra's concerts were varied, ranging from symphonic programmes to those offering more popular fare. Between October 1907 and October 1910, Barr received critical acclaim in the local press for his cornet solos with the orchestra. Two trumpet players are shown in the photograph of the orchestra that we see here, which is reportedly from 1909, but neither is Herbert Barr. We cannot be certain that he worked with the orchestra consistently during the 3-year period in which he is mentioned in the press. The biographical article reveals that when the orchestra in Eastbourne was disbanded in 1910, Barr obtained a position in an orchestra in the south of France, and while there he, and I quote, worked hard on the Bach trumpet. I have yet to establish more information on this period in Bach's career, which seems crucial in his development as a trumpet player and specialist in the Baroque repertoire. The Eastbourne Orchestra was one of the largest of its kind in England at this time. Another ensemble of similar size and which covered a similarly broad repertoire was maintained in Scarborough, a seaside resort on Yorkshire's east coast. In the summers of 1912 and 1914, a young Austrian cornet soloist by the name of Vincent Schrottenbach was engaged. In a letter to the conductor of the orchestra explaining his rejection of an offer of engagement for the 1913 season, we see that he had already changed his name to Vincent Bach. At the outbreak of World War I, Bach found himself in a precarious situation and was for a short time held in police cells. On his release, he made his way to Liverpool and boarded the Lusitania and travelled across the pond to New York. Information on George Eskdale's early life is more plentiful than that for Barr. Born in North Shields in the northeast of England in 1897, he performed in public for the first time at the age of 5. In 1819, James Eskdale, his father, began conducting brass bands in the west of Scotland, and in 1902 the Eskdale family moved to Lanarkshire. In 1905 they moved to Fife on the east coast of Scotland, when James Eskdale was appointed as the resident conductor of the Kirkcaldy Trades Band. Between the ages of 8 and 11, George appeared regularly as soloist with the band under his father's direction, and his performances were often reported in the press. Under Eskdale's leadership, the Kirkcaldy Band appeared regularly in Dundee, some 30 miles north of Kirkcaldy across the River Tay. A newspaper advertisement for one such concert on Saturday the 24th of March 1906 noted that George was to appear as soloist with the band and advised that, quote, all should hear this little cornet marvel, hear him play Round's Fantasia Bonnie Scotland with variations, a treat in himself. The highlight of James Eskdale's tenure with the Fife Band came in September 1907 when the Kirkcaldy Trades became the first Scottish band to compete in the Crystal Palace contest in London. James Eskdale parted company with the Kirkcaldy Trades Band in 1907 and moved his family to Greenock in the west of Scotland. There is very little information on George's musical activities during his 18 months in Greenock up to the middle of 1911 when he entered Kneller Hall as a band boy a few days after his 14th birthday. It has been suggested, however, that George played cornet on pleasure cruises organised by his father on the River Clyde during this period. On graduating from his one-year course at Kneller Hall, George joined the band of the 2nd Battalion of the Loyal North Lancashire Regiment, which was at this time stationed in India. At the outbreak of the First World War, his battalion was in Bangalore, but was transferred first to East Africa, then the Middle East, and finally to the Western Front. After recuperating in Scotland for a leg injury endured towards the end of his service on the Western Front, Eskdale returned to London in 19 and was engaged as an instructor at Kneller Hall, a position that enabled him to launch his playing career in the city. His initial engagements were with theatre and cinema orchestras, and in September 1922 he joined the Savoy Havana Band, the most prestigious dance band in London. Led by the American saxophonist Bert Ralton, the band was first engaged at the Savoy Hotel in September 1921 and became the leading exponent in Britain of the new jazz-style dance music that had been introduced by visiting American bands. Eskdale played alongside the American trumpeter Eddie Frizzell, who had worked with Ralton in California. In October 1923, the band left England for a 2-year tour of Australia and New Zealand. Frizzell left the band early into the tour, leaving Eskdale as the sole trumpeter. On returning to London, Eskdale worked in theatre and cinema orchestras and recorded film scores for which he reportedly received a retainer from HMV. He began performing with symphony orchestras during the late 1920s, but this was a secondary activity before his appointment to the LSO in 1932. Both Eskdale and Barr were products of the British brass band tradition. Their wide and varied musical experiences after moving on from their banding roots differentiated them from players who later graduated directly from brass bands to principal orchestral positions. Their influence was significant, and I suggest that they established an alternative orchestral style to that which can be traced back to Thomas Harper, father and son, and passed on to Walter Morrow, who was teaching the low F trumpet at the Royal College of Music into the 20th century, and then to Ernest Hall. With Eskdale teaching at the Royal Academy of Music and Hall at the Royal College, these two styles coexisted in Britain for much of the 20th century.